screen. I know. Perfect. Great. So my name is Verena, and I am a PhD researcher at Glasgow Caledonian University. And within this field of research of the more than human, I focus on the natural environment in my PhD, on like eco-social work. And more specifically, I focus on plants and the relations between people and plants in a community garden in Glasgow. So I'm going to start with giving you a brief overview of the context of my PhD research, and then ask that question of like, what language do plants speak, and what language can we find to come to an understanding with plants in this community garden. So Lamel Stables, I'm just going to make this smaller. Oops, sorry. Lamel Stables is a community garden that is situated at the very north of the city of Glasgow, and it's really nicely tucked in between the Forth and Clyde Canal on the south side and Possum Marsh, which is a nature reserve in the north. It's quite big. It spans an area of more than an acre of land, and includes many vegetable beds, flower beds, fruit trees, berry bushes, everything that you would expect from a community garden. The human community in the garden is quite small, so there's one head gardener as a member of staff, and then depending on the season, you have between 5 and 15 garden volunteers who take care of this area. And then there's obviously an uncountable number of plants growing in the garden, and we're currently actually trying to figure out to see how many different species there are in this garden. So we started counting in like early March, about 6 weeks ago. And we're already far over 100 different types of plants that we can find, and that includes like your winter veg, like broccoli and beans and leeks, but also different kinds of trees and different types of wildflowers as well. So in my contribution here to this question that we're trying to answer, I will talk from the perspective of this community garden, and that is all based on observations I've made in the last couple of months, since probably December last year, but also on numerous conversations I had with gardeners and visitors to the garden. But before I go deeper into that, just a very quick note on plants and social work. So as you might have guessed, plants have not played a very important role in social work so far, and that is probably for a number of reasons. And yeah, even in eco-social work or environmental social work, plants have pretty much been backgrounded so far, let alone the mainstream social work. Yeah, so plants have been quite backgrounded generally in Western Christian thought and science, and since social work is mostly based on Western Christian thought and science, plants have just been neglected and really underestimated. But relatively recently, plants, or like up to relatively recently actually, plants have been understood to be immobile and therefore quite passive and probably boring. But actually nowadays it's still a problem, as in not only social sciences. So I think I have to make this very clear. So social work has been neglecting plants, but also biology has been neglecting plants. So even in the natural sciences that are supposed to look at all forms of life, plants were never really interesting. And even though there's like many more plant species on this planet than there's animal species, a lot of research money just goes into researching animals rather than plants. There have been a number of social work studies that involved community gardens in the last couple of years, and they focus on a wide range of topics. So a lot of it is about food security, about social work education, and then different forms of social justice and ecological justice. So the justice narrative is quite big. But strikingly, all these publications, and even those claiming to follow an eco-social work approach, take a very anthropocentric stance towards the purpose and the use of community gardens. So everybody essentially highlights the many benefits that gardens have on human mental health, human physical health. A community garden is always defined as a community of people, but barely looked at as a more than human community. And therefore, gardening activities tend to be instrumentalized to solve social problems in a way, while other than human beings, and that is plants, but also animals, are not valued or researched as active members of these community gardens, but are more, I think, understood as a sort of tool to increase social justice or fight poverty or whatever the goal is. So coming back to the question of this panel, and I put the question when I made the slides, I put the question there a couple of times just to remind myself to not go off tangent too much. But coming back to the question, in the context of Lamb Hill Stables, I thought the main question is like, what language do plants speak? What language do plants and people share to actually be able to communicate in any way with each other? And social work doesn't really have an answer to that. But if we go to the real sciences, natural sciences, or even environmental humanities, there is actually a big discussion about the language of plants. And in order to find out what language plants speak, I refer here to Monica Gagliano and her colleagues who differentiate between the extrinsic language of plants and the intrinsic language of plants. So extrinsic language is essentially human language to describe the particularities of any form of planty life. So that includes the names we give to plants, and for including common names, but also the entire discipline of plant taxonomy, so scientific Latin names, and all the categories that we put plants in as well. So for example, what is an invasive plant? Yeah, what is a weed? What is a vegetable? All these sort of categories. And here, for example, the common nettle you see on the picture here, is that a weed or is it an important plant that supports an array of butterflies, for example? And the same with the rhododendron up there. So depending on which gardener you ask in Lamb Hill Stables, they will tell you that it is either a beautiful garden shrub or it is, and I quote, a problem that destroys the native woodlands of the Scottish Highlands. So it's kind of quite extreme. And then we have this whole thing of plant philosophy, and that's an entire discipline. It's very, very exciting. And their contributions have been very prominent in assessing the neglect of plants in Western philosophy, while also trying to actually build philosophies that take the subjectivity of plants into account. And many of those contributions in plant philosophy express, I think, both the autonomy and the relatedness of plants that is shared by many indigenous cosmologies as well. And then we have research from geography, from political ecology, for example, that contributes to a better understanding of people-plant relationships in many different contexts. So a good example is always a book called Ingrained by Leslie Head and her colleagues. Maybe you've heard of that. That looks at wheat-human relations. So they follow wheat through, like from the field, like from the grain, to the whole process of food production and so on. And then there's lots of work that analyzes the politics of unwanted plants, so any invasive species or weeds, whatever you want to call them, but also plants' capacities to influence environmental politics, and for example, the seasonality of I don't know, grapevines in Australia, for example. So there are many different examples that look at one specific plant species. And then another element of this extrinsic language that became apparent to me in the Lamb Hill Stables garden is this idea of plants as a commodity. So you can see up here in that picture, at the Christmas fair, gardeners put up plants for sale, and they were selling these tiny sempervivums for 20 cents, which is like nothing. But then still, how do you come to the conclusion that this is now what a plant is worth? And that plants are then just also sold off, as in you develop a relationship with it, but then you're just selling it off because you need money, kind of thing, for the garden to buy more plants. And also this idea of going into a garden center is like for many gardeners, that is the favorite thing to do on the weekend, go to the garden center, apply seeds and bulbs and entire plants to put into the garden. So this idea of plants as a commodity, I think, plays into this as well. So extrinsic language is really independent of any plant agency very often. Very often it is some or many projections that are being made by humans onto plants, as in like characteristics are essentially just identified as this is finite. But it is also useful because it provides us with insight into planty life, and we kind of need to find a way to talk about plants. So extrinsic language is not at all bad, but we need to be careful at how we use it, obviously. And then there is intrinsic language, and that is essentially the non-verbal language that plants use to communicate with each other, but also with other forms of life. So there has been a ton of research really into plant signaling and communication, and that found how plants use chemical cues above the Earth's surface, so in form of what is called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, but also below the Earth's surface for communication. And then they also create and they sustain these extensive carbon-based ecosystems for microbes and fungi. So maybe you have seen that on a David Attenborough documentary about forests. It's quite impressive how trees do that, but also other plants in the garden do that. And those networks are used for exchanging nutrients, but also any form of signaling. So plants use these kinds of methods to communicate with each other. So for example, to warn each other from predators, to mediate root behavior and flowering. So if, for example, plants are able to navigate their roots towards water and away from salt. And they do that not by chance, but experiments show that they very, very actively navigate the routes. And it's not just like, oh, I don't like it there, I'll just go there, but no, they know where they're going in a way. They also actively manipulate the environment, obviously, by, for example, attracting certain pollinators, but then also repelling other insects that might harm them. And plants are able to recognize their kin. So a tree is essentially able to tell whether the neighboring tree is a different species or the same species. And if the same species, they exchange more nutrients, for example. Gardeners are mostly unaware of this intrinsic language of plants because most of it happens without humans being able to perceive any of this. What we can see is the nice flowers, for example. So there are some instances where gardeners then use this intrinsic language. So for example, for flower displays, for soil monitoring, as you can see in one of those pictures, where people then test the soil for nitrogen, for example, potassium for its like nutrient content, or heavy metals. They also obviously want to attract pollinators because without pollination, there is no produce. And there's this thing, companion planting, where plants are put into one bed because they seem to like each other. We don't really know why, but tomatoes grow better when they're next to carrots. That's all we know. So there's this entire thing of companion. I'm not making this up. Companion planting is a thing. And there are entire books around it. And depending on who you ask, it's different species that like each other. So coming back to the question again, if we come back to the question, it kind of seems a bit like there is not that much in common. So plants and people don't really seem to share a common language, as in it's verbal, it's non-verbal, it's chemical, we can't really understand it. But then if we go back to the question and to actually the same, like the couple of sentences that Serge also explains after the question, is that he says that we don't know the world's language, or rather we know only various animistic, religious or mathematical versions of it. In fact, the earth speaks to us, in terms of forces, bonds and interactions, and that's enough to make a contract. So if we then think about what are the interactions between people and plants, and how do in those interactions in this garden come, how do those interactions bring together the extrinsic and the intrinsic language of plants, we might actually find some common ground. And thinking about that, there's actually three main points that I think stood out to me while I was spending time in the garden. And I would just briefly like to walk you through those. So one is that any form of encounter is always very much limited by our human senses. And that might seem very obvious, but it very often isn't to gardeners. So as I said before, gardeners are mostly unaware of the intrinsic language that goes on in the garden, and they don't know what they don't know in a way. But what is very interesting is that they very often anthropomorphize plants and the plant experience. That means that they make the assumptions in a way that plants are like humans. And I've brought some examples here. So one gardener, for example, likes pansies because they have such a pretty face. Or when there was frost at the beginning of March, people were worried because their plants must be freezing and frost might be like really cold for them, even though like plants are fine, like they live outside, they are not worried by frost, they'll be okay. And then there's this one gardener who always waters his, and this is not in a garden, but his plants at home with tea, black tea, because he likes tea, so it must be good for his plants as well. And the other thing is like people talk to plants, obviously we've all maybe done that or seen it, or play music to plants. And to a certain extent, plants are actually able to perceive the sounds because they feel it on their leaves in a way, or maybe not feel is not the right word for it. So those examples, however, show that it is kind of difficult for people to understand plant realities. And if they then use those anthropomorphisms, it might be difficult because this might actually hinder us to understand plant agency in its fullest and also independent from human life in a way. However, and there are some authors that actually argue that the problem is more the hyper-separation between plants and humans. So that actually leads to the assumption of this radical difference between plant and human beings that is actually not there. But the real problem is then not the anthropomorphism, but rather the way that assumptions of human superiority and human exceptionalism are structuring our way of thinking about plants and our perception of plant behavior and the plant characteristics. So I think the key point here is that, and this is, I think the key point is to be aware that if we enter a garden or if we just see a tree outside, there is so much going on that we do not see. And I think if there's something to be justified for like the right of nature or like a natural contract, whatever, is that we need to be aware that our perception is so tiny and it's so limited. And gardeners are not yet aware of that, even though they spend so much time in this particular space. The next point that I want to make is that gardeners, and this is something that they are aware of, very much understand the garden as a form of co-production. So they know that they contribute something to the space. But also plants contribute something to the space. So it's this idea of visitors come to the garden and then ask us like, oh, what are you growing? And then I'm always confused because the plant is growing itself. I'm just, facilitating the environment for the plant to thrive in. And gardeners are very much aware of this interplay of human and plant agency that it takes to form a garden it's not a final product, it's always like work in progress in a way. And then interestingly, for gardeners, what they then tell me is that this symbiosis, like this relationship of like we do something together with plants, actually creates this feeling of belonging, creates this feeling of, as they say, they feel close to nature. and closer to the space and the place where this is all happening. So they come back to visit the plants, they come back to care for the plants, and cultivate the garden together. And then the last point I want to make is the complexity of those interactions between people and plants. And this aspect, I think, comes short in actually most existing pieces of research, especially in social work, which are, again, very influenced by this idea of human exceptionalism and individualism. So the focus tends to be on the human side of gardening, and even there, most studies only highlight the benefits of gardening. However, I would say what I see in the garden is that there is a very careful balance of care and violence on the other side. So any so-called weed would tell you that gardening is not romantic, it's deadly. You know, so a lot of those interactions and encounters between humans and plants end deadly for certain plants because they are unwanted in a certain space. And I've had certain conversations with the gardeners there, and the argument they always bring is that, oh, it's fine because there are so many dandelions in my garden. It doesn't hurt if I just rip up a couple, you know, if I uproot them here, they still grow over there. However, that is never an argument we would make with human beings, obviously. So there is a double standard that this individualism that social work is so pushing in mainstream social work practice and research, I guess, does very much not apply when we talk about plants. So the question is, how do we handle this? How do we handle this complexity of care on the one side, but then violence and power on the other side? And what does that mean for the ethics of gardening, but also for the ethics, for example, of more than human research in gardens? Like, how do we negotiate all these different concepts of what is knowledge, what is ethics, what is harm, what is consent, what is anonymity? What does that mean when I work with beings in a garden that are not human? And I don't know yet because I'm not finished with my PhD yet. And even then I will not know, but it's kind of those questions that make it very hard for me to do this kind of research because nobody has an answer to it. And maybe there is no answer. But yeah, that is also the note I want to end on. So I think a lot is about awareness when we think about plants, being aware of the capacities of plants in the first place, but then also being aware of the limited perception that we as human beings have, and all of the things that cannot be observed, particularly visually, because we're so focused on visual. That's why I put all the images there, on visual senses. And yeah, how do you handle that complexity? How do we deal with all the things that are not translatable and unspeakable in our interactions with planty beings? And that's me. Heather.
Useful on this point, especially for watching by the stairs if anyone is curious.